Chicago, 1982. The air was thick with dust as the demolition crew made their way through the grand foyer of the Majestic Theater, a once glorious establishment that had stood on State Street since 1921. Ray Connors, the foreman, wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the decaying Art Deco interior. The theater had been shuttered since 1978, another victim of suburban flight and the rise of multiplexes. "Mike, take the boys and start clearing out the east wall. We need to check the structural integrity before we bring in the heavy equipment tomorrow," Ray called out to his second-in-command. Mike nodded, gesturing to three workers who followed him toward the ornate wall covered in peeling gold leaf. The Majestic had once been the crown jewel of Chicago's theater district, hosting vaudeville acts, silent films, and eventually talkies. Now it was just another demolition job making way for a modern office complex. Ray walked through what remained of the lobby, stepping over fallen plaster and broken tiles. Something about this place had always unsettled him. He'd been in the demolition business for 15 years, but there was an unusual stillness here that raised the hair on his neck. "Hey, Ray, you better come see this." Mike's voice echoed from inside the auditorium. Ray made his way through the debris, navigating around collapsed seats and fallen ceiling fixtures. Mike was standing near what had once been the stage, pointing at a section of wall they'd just exposed. "What the hell?" Ray muttered. Embedded in the wall was what appeared to be a mannequin arm, jutting out from the plaster as if reaching for help. It was yellowed with age, the joints cracked and worn. "Probably just some old theater prop," Ray said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Mike shook his head. "No way. Look how it's positioned. Someone deliberately placed this here and plastered over it." Ray stepped closer, examining the discolored limb. "All right, keep going. See what else is in there." As the workers continued carefully removing sections of wall, more was revealed: a torso, another arm, and finally, a head. The mannequin was complete, a female figure dressed in tattered 1920s clothing, her painted face frozen in what seemed like a silent scream. "Jesus," whispered one of the younger workers, stepping back. "It's just a dummy," Ray said firmly, though the unease in his stomach grew. Old theaters used to store props in strange places. "Let's keep going." By midday, they had uncovered 3 more mannequins in different walls throughout the theater. Each one was positioned differently. One appeared to be climbing, another kneeling in prayer, and a third with its arms outstretched as if pleading. All were dressed in period clothing from the 1920s, and all showed signs of age and neglect. "I don't like this, Ray," Mike said quietly as they stood looking at their discoveries, now laid out in a row on the dusty stage. "Why would anyone seal mannequins inside the walls?" Ray had no answer. He'd seen strange things in old buildings before: time capsules, hidden rooms, even the occasional animal skeleton, but nothing like this. The mannequin's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved across the stage, their painted pupils somehow always directed at him. "Let's take a break," he finally said. "We'll come back and finish this section after lunch." As the crew filed out toward their trucks, Ray hung back, taking one last look at the mannequins. In the silence of the abandoned theater, he could have sworn he heard something. A faint whisper, like fabric rustling against plaster. He quickly turned and hurried after his men, telling himself it was just the old building settling. But deep down, Ray Connors knew they had stumbled upon something that had been deliberately hidden away. And as the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the broken windows of the Majestic Theater, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Eleanor Mitchell had been with the Chicago Tribune for 6 years, but she was still stuck writing fluff pieces for the lifestyle section. At 32, she was hungry for something substantial, a story that would finally earn her a spot in the news department. When she overheard 2 reporters discussing mannequins found in the walls of the old Majestic Theater, she knew this could be her chance. "I want this story," Eleanor told her editor Frank Gaines the following morning. "It's weird, it's local, and nobody else is covering it yet." Frank looked up from his coffee, skepticism etched across his weathered face. "It's probably nothing. Ellie, old buildings have all sorts of junk in them. 12 mannequins deliberately sealed in walls isn't junk, Frank. It's bizarre. And bizarre sells papers." She placed her notepad on his desk. "Let me follow this for a few days. If it goes nowhere, I'll drop it." Frank sighed, the sound of a man who'd long ago learned to pick his battles. 3 days. That's it. Eleanor spent that afternoon at the city archives, digging through records of the Majestic Theater, constructed in 1921 by Marcus Blackwood, a wealthy businessman with interests in banking and real estate. The theater had been the cornerstone of Chicago's entertainment district for decades. But beneath the glitz and glamour, Eleanor discovered hints of something darker. A small article from 1923 mentioned the mysterious disappearance of a seamstress who worked at the theater, Another from 1926 reported a stagehand found dead in the basement, the cause ruled as accidental. Most intriguing was a piece from 1927 about chorus girls refusing to perform, claiming they heard voices from the walls. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the demolition site just as the crew was setting up. The foreman, a tall man with calloused hands and tired eyes, introduced himself as Ray Connors. "I was wondering when the press would show up," he said, offering her a hard hat, "though I figured it'd be one of those tabloid rags, not the Tribune." "So it's true about the mannequins?" Eleanor asked, following him through the theater's broken entrance. Ray nodded grimly. 17 so far. We found 5 more yesterday after you called. Never seen anything like it in all my years doing this job." Inside, the mannequins had been arranged in a row along what remained of the stage. Eleanor felt a chill as she approached them, noting the detail in their painted faces and the authenticity of their period clothing. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward one. "Be my guest. We've all touched them. They're just dummies." Eleanor ran her fingers along the arm of a female mannequin dressed in a beaded flapper dress. The material was real, though rotted with age. The mannequin's face was painted with remarkable skill. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes that seemed to hold an expression of fear. "Have you notified the police?" she asked. Ray laughed, though the sound held no humor. "And tell them what we found old store mannequins? They'd think we were wasting their time. Where exactly were they found?" Ray led her through the theater, pointing out the holes in various walls where the mannequins had been extracted. Always between the outer wall and an inner one, sealed up tight. Whoever put them there never meant for them to be found. Eleanor took photographs and detailed notes, but her most significant discovery came when she examined the mannequins more closely. On the back of one's neck, barely visible beneath the collar of its shirt, was a small mark, not a manufacturer's stamp as she'd initially thought, but what appeared to be initials carved into the material, AG. She found similar markings on 3 other mannequins, each in different locations: behind an ear, inside a wrist, on the small of a back. Different initials, but clearly made by the same hand. "Ray," she called out, "I think someone was signing their work." As the day wore on, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. The mannequins weren't just theatrical props. They were too detailed, too individualistic. Each face had distinct features, as if modeled after real people. When she finally left the site at dusk, Eleanor had pages of notes and dozens of photographs. She was so engrossed in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice the elderly man watching her from across the street, his thin frame leaning heavily on a cane. When their eyes met, he quickly turned away, shuffling toward a waiting taxi. Eleanor hesitated, then hurried after him. "Excuse me, sir." But the man was already climbing into the cab. As it pulled away, Eleanor caught a glimpse of his face through the window, lined with age but distinguished. His eyes filled with what looked like fear, or was it guilt? Back in her apartment that night, Eleanor spread her notes across her kitchen table, connecting threads of information with growing excitement. This wasn't just a quirky local interest story. There was something here, something hidden beneath decades of silence and plaster. As she worked late into the night, the wind picked up outside, rattling her windows. Eleanor pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, unable to shake the memory of those painted eyes staring up at her from the theater stage, eyes that somehow seemed to be silently screaming. The Chicago Historical Society occupied a stately neoclassical building in Lincoln Park. Eleanor arrived early the next morning, armed with her press credentials and a determination to uncover more about the majestic theater and its hidden mannequins. Dr. Patricia Wellen, the head archivist, was initially reluctant to help. "We get a lot of journalists looking for sensational stories about old Chicago," she said, peering at Eleanor over wire-rimmed glasses. "They usually twist the facts to fit whatever narrative they've already decided on." "I'm not looking to sensationalize anything," Eleanor assured her. "I just want to understand why someone would seal mannequins inside the walls of a theater." Something in Eleanor's earnestness must have convinced Dr. Wellen, because she led her to a research room and returned 20 minutes later with several boxes of materials. "These are the Blackwood papers," she explained. Marcus Blackwood owned the Majestic and several other theaters in Chicago during the 1920s. His personal and business records were donated to us after his death in 1952. Eleanor spent hours sifting through financial statements, correspondence, and newspaper clippings. Marcus Blackwood emerged as a complex figure, a ruthless businessman with a passion for the arts and a reputation for extravagance. The Majestic had been his crowning achievement, designed to rival the great theaters of New York and Europe. Buried among contracts and receipts, Eleanor found something curious: regular payments to someone named Albert Grimes, listed as artistic consultant. The payments began in 1922 and continued until 1927, when they abruptly stopped. "Dr. Wellen," Eleanor called out, "do you have any information on Albert Grimes?" The archivist thought for a moment. The name sounds familiar. "Let me check our artist files." When she returned, Dr. Wellen carried a thin folder. Albert Grimes was a sculptor who worked in Chicago in the 1920s. He wasn't particularly well known, but he did create pieces for several public buildings, including some of the ornamentation for the Majestic Theater. Inside the folder were photographs of Grimes' work, mostly architectural details and decorative elements. But one image made Eleanor's breath catch: a series of life-sized figures created for a department store window display. The mannequins in the photograph were remarkably similar to those found in the theater walls, the same attention to detail, the same lifelike quality. "Did he specialize in mannequins?" Eleanor asked. Dr. Wellen shook her head. "Not that I'm aware of. But there's not much information about him after 1927. She hesitated, then added, "Actually, there's a note here that he disappeared that year. The police investigated but never found him. 1927, the same year the payments from Blackwood stopped." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Further digging revealed more troubling connections. Between 1922 and 1927, 7 people associated with the Majestic Theater had gone missing: 3 chorus girls, a ticket seller, 2 stagehands, and a costume designer. The disappearances had been investigated separately, with little connection made between them at the time. By late afternoon, Eleanor had compiled a timeline that made her increasingly uneasy. The missing persons cases aligned perfectly with the periods when Grimes was receiving his largest payments from Blackwood. As she was preparing to leave, Dr. Wellen approached with one final document. "I remembered where I'd heard of Grimes before," she said quietly. "This is from the personal journal of Detective Michael Sullivan, who investigated several disappearances in the theater district. It was never made public. The journal entry was dated November 12, 1927. Interviewed M. Blackwood again regarding the disappearance of Alice Garner Chorus. He remains uncooperative. Mentioned my suspicions about the other missing persons connected to his theater. He became agitated, saying I was imagining connections where none exist. Before leaving, he made a strange comment. People don't just disappear, Detective. Sometimes they're right in front of you, watching everything you do. I'm convinced he knows more than he's saying, but without evidence, my hands are tied." Eleanor stared at the page, her mind racing. Alice Garner AG, the initials carved into one of the mannequins. "Dr. Wellen," she asked slowly, "is there any record of what these missing people looked like? Photographs, descriptions?" The archivist nodded. "We should have employment records for the theater staff, possibly with photographs. Personnel files were quite detailed back then for performance venues." It took another hour to locate the records, but when Eleanor finally held the photograph of Alice Garner, her suspicion crystallized into horrified certainty. The young woman in the image had the same high cheekbones, the same full lips as the mannequin with a G carved into its neck. With trembling hands, Eleanor compared the other photographs to her pictures of the mannequins. The resemblance was undeniable in case after case. The mannequins weren't just modeled after these people, they were perfect replicas, down to the smallest detail. As Eleanor gathered her notes, a newspaper clipping slipped from one of the folders, a small obituary dated December 30th, 1927. Albert Grimes, aged 42, had been found dead in his studio, an apparent suicide. The article mentioned that he had left a note saying only, "They wanted art that captured the human soul. God forgive me, I found a way." Outside, darkness had fallen. Eleanor hailed a taxi, her mind whirling with theories, each more disturbing than the last. What had Grimes done? What had Blackwood asked him to do? And why had they hidden the evidence in the walls of the theater? The taxi pulled up to her apartment building, but as Eleanor paid the driver, she noticed a car parked across the street, the same one she'd seen earlier outside the Historical Society. As she watched, the elderly man from the previous day stepped out, his eyes fixed on her with unmistakable purpose. This time Eleanor didn't run. Instead, she steeled herself and walked directly toward him, clutching her bag of evidence tightly against her chest. "You've been following me," she said, stopping a few feet away. "Why?" The old man's hands trembled slightly as he leaned on his cane. "Because you're asking questions about the Majestic," he replied, his voice thin but clear. "About things that should stay buried. Who are you?" Eleanor demanded. The man's eyes, watery with age but still sharp, held hers steadily. "My name is William Blackwood. Marcus was my father, and I think it's time someone finally knew the truth." Eleanor led William Blackwood to a small coffee shop around the corner from her apartment. Despite his age, he had to be in his 70s. He moved with determination, as if a great weight was finally being lifted. "I've been watching the demolition site," he explained once they were seated in a quiet booth. "When I saw them remove the first mannequin, I knew it was finally happening. The thing I've feared my entire life." "What exactly is it?" Eleanor asked, her recorder discreetly running on the table between them. William's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "The revelation of what my father did, of what he allowed to happen in that theater." He began his story slowly, describing how Marcus Blackwood had built the Majestic Theater as a testament to his wealth and influence in Chicago. "My father wasn't just ambitious, he was obsessed with creating something unique, something that would ensure his legacy long after he was gone. In 1922, Marcus had met Albert Grimes, a struggling sculptor with revolutionary ideas about capturing the essence of humanity in art. Grimes believed that true art required more than skill, it required the artist to somehow capture the subject's soul." William paused, his expression haunted. "My father was intrigued. He commissioned Grimes to create decorative pieces for the theater, but privately he encouraged the sculptors more experimental work. At first, Grimes created conventional mannequins for the theater's promotional displays, but soon his work became more refined, more lifelike. Marcus was delighted, displaying the figures prominently in the theater lobby. Then people started disappearing," William continued, "theater employees mostly. Each time a new mannequin would appear, more perfect than the last. I was just a boy, but even I could see the resemblance." Eleanor felt a chill despite the coffee shop's warmth. "Are you saying Grimes was killing these people?" William shook his head slowly. "Worse. My father told me years later, when he was dying and the guilt had finally broken him. Grimes had developed a technique, a chemical process that somehow preserved people while they were still alive, turning them into these perfect sculptures." Eleanor stared in disbelief. "That's impossible, is it?" William countered. "Science has discovered plenty of compounds that can preserve organic material. Grimes was experimenting with formulations no one had tried before. He believed he could capture a person at the height of their emotional state, fear, joy, love, and preserve that essence forever. But that would be murder," Eleanor whispered. "My father didn't see it that way, not at first. He considered it a contribution to art. These weren't important people. He'd say just chorus girls and stagehands. Disposable." Williams's voice cracked with disgust. By the time he realized the horror of what he was financing, Grimes had become unstable, threatening to expose everything unless my father continued funding his work. "In late 1927, Marcus Blackwood had finally put an end to it," William explained. "He had his men take all of Grimes' sculptures and seal them within the walls of the theater, hidden away where no one would ever find them." "And Grimes?" Eleanor asked. "Officially, he committed suicide. Unofficially, ... William let the implication hang in the air. "My father made sure the scandal died with him." Eleanor's mind was reeling. "But why are you telling me this now? You could have stayed anonymous." William Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. "Because I've carried this secret for too long. Because those people deserve justice, even after all these years. And because," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "I think some part of them is still aware." "What do you mean?" "When I was a boy, after the mannequins were sealed away, I would sometimes hear sounds from inside the walls, not voices exactly, but something like distant crying. My father said it was just the building settling, but I knew better." William leaned forward. "And last week, when they brought out the first one, I swear to you, I saw its fingers move." Eleanor felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "That's not possible. Whatever Grimes did to those people, it wasn't just preservation. I think he found a way to suspend them between life and death, trapped, aware but unable to move or speak." William's hands trembled. For 60 years, the implications were too horrific to contemplate. If what William was saying was true, those mannequins weren't just evidence of historical murders. They were the victims themselves, somehow still conscious after decades entombed in darkness. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Eleanor asked finally. "Tell their story. Make sure people know what happened to them." William reached into his coat and removed an aged leather journal. This was Grimes' research diary. "My father kept it as insurance. It details everything, the process, the victims, all of it. It's proof." As Eleanor took the journal, William added, "But be careful. There are still powerful people in this city with connections to my father, people who wouldn't want this story told." Outside, the night had grown colder. Eleanor walked William to his car, her mind still struggling to process everything she'd heard. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as the delusions of an old man burdened by family shame. But the connections were too perfect, the evidence too compelling. "I'll be leaving Chicago tonight," William said as he opened his car door. "I've said what I needed to say. The rest is up to you." as she watched his taillights disappear into the darkness. Eleanor clutched Grimes' journal to her chest, already formulating the opening lines of her article. This was the story that would define her career, perhaps even change history. But as she turned toward her apartment, a new thought stopped her cold. If the mannequins were indeed still somehow conscious, what would happen when the demolition crew destroyed them? Eleanor broke into a run, heading for the nearest payphone to call Ray Connors. Whatever the truth was, they needed to stop the demolition at least until she could uncover the full story of what really happened at the Majestic Theater. Back in her apartment, Eleanor locked the door, drew the curtains, and placed Albert Grimes' journal on her desk. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. She hesitated before opening it, feeling as if she were about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. The first few entries were mundane supply lists, sketches of architectural details, notes on various sculpting techniques. But as she progressed through the journal, Grimes' writings became increasingly erratic, filled with grandiose ideas about transcending the limitations of art and capturing true human essence. An entry from March 1923 marked a turning point. MB visited today, expressed disappointment with conventional methods, wants something revolutionary for his theater, mentioned his interest in Egyptian mummification techniques and how the ancients believed they preserved the soul. This has given me ideas. The chemical formulation I've been experimenting with shows promise. Need a subject to test it on? Eleanor turned the page with trembling fingers. The next entry, dated 2 weeks later, was written in a more frantic hand. IT worked. God help me, it worked. Lillian volunteered, thinking it was just a plaster cast process. She didn't understand what the chemicals would do. The preservation is perfect, her skin, her eyes, the expression of surprise frozen on her face. She looks alive, yet completely still. MB is ecstatic. Says this is just the beginning. Paid me triple the agreed amount. What have I done? Accompanying the text was a detailed sketch of a young woman's face, labeled Lillian Cooper, chorus girl. Eleanor recognized her immediately as one of the mannequins from the theater. As she read on, the journal documented Grimes' descent into madness. At first, he expressed remorse, writing about nightmares and hearing Lillian's voice crying from inside her perfect prison. But as Marcus Blackwood's payments increased, so did Grimes' willingness to continue. Each victim was carefully documented: name, occupation, date of transformation. Most were theater employees, selected by Blackwood for their physical beauty or expressive features. Grimes described his process in clinical detail, how he had refined the chemical formula to work faster, to better preserve the living essence of his subjects. Most disturbing were his observations that the victims remained somehow aware after the process was complete. They cannot move, cannot speak, but something remains. Their eyes follow me around the studio. Sometimes I hear them at night, not voices, but a kind of collective sigh, like wind through a narrow space. Says I'm imagining things, they're just objects now. But I know better. They watch. They wait. They remember. By 1927, Grimes' entries became increasingly paranoid. He suspected Blackwood was planning to end their arrangement, possibly violently. His final entry, dated the day before his reported suicide, was chilling. B sent men to collect all my work today. They're sealing them in the walls of the theater, hiding the evidence. He thinks this ends it. He's wrong. They won't stay hidden forever, and they won't forget what was done to them. I've made certain of that with the final formulation. As long as they exist, some part of them remains aware, watching, waiting. God forgive me for what I've created. Eleanor closed the journal, feeling physically ill. If even half of what Grimes had written was true, the mannequins weren't just evidence of historical murders, they were the victims themselves. Suspended in some horrific state between life and death for over 60 years, she reached for her phone to call Ray Connors again. She'd left an urgent message earlier, but hadn't been able to reach him. The demolition was scheduled to continue tomorrow, and if what Grimes had written was true... The phone rang just as she picked it up, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the receiver. "Eleanor Mitchell," she answered, her voice unsteady. "Miss Mitchell? This is Mike Donovan from the demolition crew. You left a message for Ray." "Yes. I need to speak with him immediately about stopping the demolition." "Ray's in the hospital," Mike interrupted. "There was an accident at the site tonight." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. "What kind of accident?" "He went back to secure some equipment after everyone left. Found him at the bottom of the orchestra pit, unconscious. Said he fell, but ... Mike hesitated. "The weird thing is he keeps saying someone pushed him, that one of those mannequins moved." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. "Listen to me carefully. Those mannequins aren't what we think they are. You need to make sure no one damages them until I can get there tomorrow with evidence." "Evidence of what? Just trust me. It's important. And, Mike, don't stay alone with them. Not at night." After hanging up, Eleanor knew sleep would be impossible. She spent the night organizing her notes, making copies of the most important pages from Grimes' journal, and preparing what she would say to the police. By dawn, she had outlined her article as well, a piece that would shock Chicago and possibly rewrite a dark chapter of the city's history. As she finally dozed off in her chair, Eleanor's dreams were filled with frozen faces silently screaming, mannequin hands reaching through plaster, and eyes, dozens of painted eyes, all watching her with 60 years of accumulated rage. The shrill ring of the telephone jolted Eleanor awake. Disoriented, she fumbled for the receiver, notes and photocopies sliding from her lap to the floor. "Hello?" she croaked, her voice rough from sleep. "Miss Mitchell?" The voice was unfamiliar, female, elderly. "My name's Margaret Winters. You don't know me, but I need to speak with you about the Majestic Theater." Eleanor sat up straighter, instantly alert. "How did you get my number?" "William Blackwood contacted me last night. I understand he's shared certain information with you." The woman's voice wavered slightly. "I worked as a ticket seller at the Majestic from 1925 to 1928. I knew the people who disappeared. Can we meet?" Eleanor asked, already reaching for her notepad. "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm 83 years old and I've spent my life trying to forget what I saw. I won't revisit it in person, but I owe it to Lillian and the others to warn you." "Warn me about what?" There was a pause, filled only with the sound of Margaret's labored breathing. "You're planning to write about this, to expose what Blackwood and Grimes did?" "Yes, of course. People need to know the truth." "The truth," Margaret echoed, a bitter note in her voice. The truth is darker than even William knows. Marcus Blackwood didn't just fund Grimes' experiments, he participated in them. He selected the victims, watched the process, took pleasure in it. Eleanor shivered despite the morning warmth. "How do you know this?" "Because I was supposed to be one of them." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "Blackwood had chosen me. I found out what was happening when I overheard him talking to Grimes. I fled Chicago that night and never returned until after I heard Blackwood had died, but the police were paid off." Margaret interrupted. "This was Chicago in the 1920s, Miss Mitchell. Money bought silence. The few detectives who asked questions found themselves reassigned or discharged." Eleanor thought of Detective Sullivan's journal entry and its abrupt end. "What about Grimes' suicide?" Margaret gave a harsh laugh. "Albert Grimes didn't kill himself. Blackwood had him eliminated when he became a liability. But not before Grimes made his final creation." "Final creation?" Marcus Blackwood's wife disappeared in late 1927. The official story was that she'd run off with a lover. The truth? She'd discovered what her husband was doing and threatened to expose him. Grimes' last subject was Catherine Blackwood. Eleanor gasped. "William's mother?" "Yes. William was away at boarding school when it happened. I don't think he ever knew. But that's why I'm calling you, Miss Mitchell. The Blackwood family still has influence in the city. Catherine may be sealed in that theater, but there are living people who will do anything to keep these secrets buried." "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying proceed with caution. Powerful men protect their legacies, even from the grave." Margaret paused. "There's something else you should know. About the mannequins themselves." Eleanor held her breath, waiting. "In 1952, when Marcus Blackwood was dying, I received a letter from him. I'd changed my name, moved several times, but somehow he found me. The letter contained only one sentence. At night, I hear them whispering through the walls. I think whatever Grimes did to those people, some part of them remained conscious and vengeful." After the call ended, Eleanor sat motionless, trying to process this new information. The implications were staggering, not just historical murders, but an ongoing atrocity if the victims were indeed still conscious in some way. She quickly dressed and gathered her materials, including Grimes' journal. Her first stop would be the police station to report her findings. Then the demolition site to ensure the mannequins weren't destroyed before a proper investigation could begin. Outside her apartment building, the street was quiet in the early morning light. Eleanor hailed a passing taxi, giving the driver the address of the nearest precinct. As the cab pulled away, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its engine running. Through the tinted windows, she could just make out the silhouette of someone watching her depart. At the police station, Eleanor was directed to Detective James Harper, a serious-faced man in his 40s who listened to her story with increasing skepticism. "Miss Mitchell," he said when she'd finished, "you're asking me to believe that mannequins found in an old theater are actually people who were murdered 60 years ago, and that they're somehow still conscious?" "I know how it sounds," Eleanor admitted, "but I have evidence." She placed Grimes' journal on the desk between them. "This documents everything, the victims, the process, all of it." Detective Harper flipped through the journal, his expression unreadable. And you got this from William Blackwood, who conveniently left town last night. Yes, but there's also Margaret Winters, who worked at the theater, and the employment records at the Historical Society that match the mannequins to missing persons from that period. Harper closed the journal. I'll look into it. But I can't stop a legally permitted demolition based on what could be an elaborate hoax or the delusions of an old man ashamed of his father's legacy. People are in danger, Eleanor insisted. The foreman was already injured last night. Accidents happen at demolition sites all the time. Harper stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Leave the journal with me. I'll have someone check the theater today. As Eleanor left the station, frustration burning in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. She directed her next taxi to the Majestic Theater, determined to at least document everything before it was too late. The demolition site was buzzing with activity when she arrived. Heavy equipment had been brought in overnight, and workers were preparing to take down major sections of the building. Eleanor spotted Mike near the entrance and hurried over to him. "Where are the mannequins?" she asked without preamble. Mike jerked his thumb toward what had once been the theater's grand lobby. "Still in there. We were told not to move them until some specialist from the Historical Society comes to collect them." Eleanor felt a surge of relief. "How's Ray doing?" "Better. They're keeping him for observation, but he's conscious." Mike lowered his voice. "He's still saying one of those things pushed him, though the doctors think it's just a concussion making him confused." "I need to see them again," Eleanor said. "And I need photographs of exactly where each one was found in the walls." Mike hesitated. "We're supposed to start the heavy demolition in an hour." "I don't think. Please, Mike, it's important." Something in her tone must have convinced him. "All right, but make it quick." Inside, the mannequins had been arranged in a loose circle in what remained of the lobby. In the harsh light of the work lamps, they seemed even more lifelike than Eleanor remembered, their painted eyes gleaming, their poses suggesting interrupted movement. She moved among them slowly, matching each face to the photographs she'd found in the Historical Society records. Lillian Cooper, the first victim. Alice Garner, whose initials were carved into the mannequin's neck. Thomas Wilkes, a stagehand who had disappeared in early 1925. And there at the back of the group, a woman in an elegant 1920s evening gown, her face bearing a striking resemblance to William Blackwood Catherine, his mother, Grimes' final victim. Eleanor approached this last mannequin carefully. Unlike the others, Catherine's pose suggested not fear but fury, her arms slightly raised, her fingers curved as if reaching for someone's throat. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even individual eyelashes had been meticulously rendered. As Eleanor leaned closer to examine the face, she could have sworn she saw the eyes shift slightly to meet hers. She jerked back involuntarily. "Just a trick of the light," she muttered to herself. Mike appeared at her side. "Found something?" "Maybe." Eleanor pointed to Catherine's mannequin. "This one looks different from the others. The technique seems more refined, almost as if..." She was interrupted by a loud crash from outside, followed by shouting. Mike cursed under his breath. "Stay here," he said, hurrying toward the commotion. Alone with the mannequins, Eleanor felt a sudden drop in temperature. The lobby, previously filled with dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through broken windows, now seemed darker, the air heavier. She told herself it was just clouds passing overhead. She continued examining the mannequins, taking photographs with her camera. When she reached Albert Grimes' first victim, Lillian Cooper, she noticed something she'd missed before, a small piece of paper protruding from a tear in the mannequin's dress. Carefully, Eleanor extracted what appeared to be a folded note. The paper was brittle with age, threatening to crumble in her fingers as she gently opened it. Inside, written in faded ink, was a message. "If you're reading this, they've finally been found. Tell our story. But beware, the preservation process affects more than just flesh. Our anger has been gathering strength for decades. At night, we can already move a little. Soon we'll be free. And we remember everything." Elsie Eleanor stared at the note, her heart pounding. If this was authentic, if Lillian Cooper had somehow managed to conceal this message while being transformed, did confirm the most horrifying aspect of Grimes' journal. The victims were conscious, had been conscious all along. A soft sound behind her made Eleanor spin around. For a moment she thought one of the mannequins had shifted position. Catherine's arm seemed slightly higher than before, her head tilted at a different angle. But that was impossible. "Miss Mitchell?" A man's voice called from the entrance. "Detective Harper sent me to collect evidence." Eleanor turned to see a plainclothes officer entering the lobby, his badge glinting on his belt. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Officer Blackwood," he replied. "Daniel Blackwood." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Blackwood? Are you related to—" "Marcus was my grandfather," he said smoothly, approaching her. "William is my uncle." Our family has been quite concerned about the stories you're planning to write." Eleanor backed away, suddenly aware of how isolated she was. The sounds of construction outside seemed very far away. "Detective Harper shouldn't have told you about our conversation." Daniel Blackwood smiled thinly. "The Chicago police and the Blackwood family have always had a mutually beneficial relationship. Now I'll need that note you just found, as well as any other evidence you've collected." Eleanor clutched her camera and the note tighter. "This is evidence of historical crimes. It belongs in the public record." "My grandfather's legacy belongs to our family," Blackwood countered, his voice hardening. "We've protected it for decades. One ambitious reporter isn't going to change that." As he stepped closer, Eleanor noticed something else. His eyes were the same unusual shade of gray as Catherine Blackwood's in the mannequin. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked, continuing to back away until she felt the cold, smooth surface of a mannequin behind her. "Kill me like your grandfather killed these people?" Blackwood shook his head. "Nothing so dramatic. You'll have an accident. Tragic, but not uncommon at demolition sites, particularly ones where the floor has been deliberately weakened." With horror, Eleanor realized he was herding her toward the orchestra pit where Ray had fallen. "Someone will find out the truth eventually," she said, desperately playing for time. "The mannequins," Grimes' journal, "the mannequins will be destroyed in today's demolition. As for the journal, it's probably already been misplaced at the station. Evidence does have a way of disappearing in this city." Eleanor glanced desperately toward the exit, but Blackwood stood between her and escape. As she frantically considered her options, she became aware of something extraordinary happening behind him. Catherine's mannequin was moving. It was subtle at first, fingers flexing, head turning fractionally, but undeniable. As Eleanor watched in astonishment, the other mannequins began to move as well, their joints creaking like old hinges, their painted eyes focusing on Daniel Blackwood's back. Blackwood, misinterpreting her expression as fear of him, smiled. "No one will believe your wild theories, Miss Mitchell. The Majestic's secrets will remain buried, just as they have for 60 years. "I wouldn't be so sure about that," Eleanor whispered, unable to tear her eyes from the sight behind him. Something in her tone made Blackwood turn. The color drained from his face as he saw what Eleanor had been watching, 17 mannequins now fully animated, moving with jerky but purposeful motions, surrounding them in a tightening circle. Catherine's mannequin stepped forward, her painted features somehow expressing decades of rage despite their fixed nature. Her arms reached toward her grandson with unmistakable intent. "This isn't possible," Blackwood gasped, backing away. "They're just objects. They can't." His words were cut off as Catherine's mannequin lunged forward with surprising speed, her wooden fingers closing around his throat. The other mannequins converged on him, their movements becoming more fluid with each passing second, as if they were remembering how to use their long frozen limbs. Eleanor seized the opportunity to run, squeezing past the macabre scene toward the exit. Behind her, Blackwood's terrified screams were abruptly silenced. Outside, she collided with Mike, who was returning to the lobby. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, steadying her. "I heard shouting." Eleanor struggled to catch her breath. "We need to evacuate the site, now, and call the police, the real police." "What are you talking about? What's happening in there?" Before Eleanor could answer, a tremendous crash came from inside the theater, followed by an unnatural silence. She looked back to see dust billowing from the lobby entrance. "I think," she said slowly, "that justice is finally being served." The collapse of the Majestic Theater's lobby made headlines across Chicago. 8 people were injured, though miraculously, no one was killed except for Daniel Blackwood, whose body was recovered from beneath the rubble 2 days later. The official report cited structural failure as the cause, accelerated by the recent removal of load-bearing walls during the demolition process. What the report didn't mention were the strange marks found on Blackwood's throat, or the fact that his body was surrounded by fragments of mannequins, arranged in what one rescue worker described as almost a ceremonial pattern. Eleanor spent those 2 days being questioned by real police this time, including a detective from the state attorney's office who took her allegations of historical murders seriously. Grimes' journal, which had indeed gone missing from the local precinct, resurfaced after an anonymous tip led investigators to Detective Harper's home safe. William Blackwood never returned to Chicago. 3 days after the collapse, his body was found in a hotel room in St. Louis, an apparent suicide. The note he left behind contained only 5 words. They were never just mannequins. Ray Connors recovered from his accident, confirmed Eleanor's account of the mannequins found in the theater walls, though he refused to speculate on whether they had been anything other than elaborate props. "All I know," he told investigators, "is that I never felt right in that building, like there were eyes on me all the time. Margaret Winters agreed to a single interview with Eleanor, during which she identified several of the mannequins from photographs as people she had known who disappeared in the 1920s. Her testimony, combined with employment records and missing persons reports from the era, provided compelling evidence that Marcus Blackwood and Albert Grimes had indeed been responsible for at least 17 disappearances and likely murders. The remains of the mannequins recovered from the theater site were examined by forensic experts, who made a startling discovery. Beneath the outer layer of paint and varnish was organic material that DNA testing confirmed to be human. The preservation process Grimes had described in his journal was real. He had somehow developed a method to transform living people into mannequin-like figures while preserving their organic structure. What couldn't be explained, at least not scientifically, was how those figures had apparently animated themselves 60 years later. The only witness to that event was Eleanor, and she was careful about how she described what she had seen, knowing that too much of the truth would undermine her credibility and the justice she sought for the victims. On a cold October morning in 1982, 1 month after the collapse, Eleanor stood in Lincoln Park Cemetery watching as 17 coffins were laid to rest in a special memorial service. The victims had been identified through DNA matching with living relatives, many of whom were present, finally able to say goodbye to loved ones who had vanished generations ago. As the minister concluded the service, Eleanor felt a presence beside her and turned to find Dr. Patricia Whelan from the Historical Society. "A remarkable piece of historical detective work," Dr. Whelan said quietly. "Your article has changed how we'll view Chicago's theater district forever." Eleanor's 4-part series for the Tribune, titled The Majestic's Mannequins, Murder and Cover-Up in 1920s Chicago, had been published to national acclaim. It detailed Marcus Blackwood's crimes, Albert Grimes' grotesque art, and the decades-long cover-up by the Blackwood family, all meticulously documented and carefully sourced. Quote, what the article didn't mention was Lillian Cooper's note, which Eleanor had kept. Nor did it speculate on how 17 preserved victims had somehow enacted their own vengeance after 60 years of silent watching from within the theater walls. "There's one thing I still don't understand, Doctor," Whelan continued as they walked away from the gravesite. "In Grimes' journal, he mentions a final chemical formulation, something he developed just before his death. But the formula itself isn't recorded." Eleanor nodded. "I noticed that too. Whatever it was, he took that secret to his grave. Perhaps that's for the best," Dr. Whelan mused. "Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve." As they reached the cemetery gates, Eleanor paused, looking back at the 17 fresh graves. "Do you believe in justice, Dr. Whelan? Not just legal justice, but something deep, something that can't be stopped even by time." The archivist considered the question carefully. "I believe that truth has a power of its own. It may be buried, sealed away, forgotten, but it never truly dies. And when it finally emerges, ... double quotes, she shivered slightly. Well, we've seen what can happen." That evening, alone in her apartment, Eleanor finally allowed herself to reread Lillian Cooper's note. The paper had grown more brittle since she'd found it, as if whatever preservation process had maintained it for 60 years was rapidly breaking down. "If you're reading this, they've finally been found. Tell our story. But beware, the preservation process affects more than just flesh. Our anger has been gathering strength for decades. At night, we can already move a little. Soon we'll be free, and we remember everything." Elsie Eleanor had told their story, just as Lillian had asked. The truth was now part of the historical record, the victims properly mourned and laid to rest. Justice, in its way, had been served. Yet as she placed the note in a small box with her other mementos from the case, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if Grimes' process had somehow preserved not just his victims' bodies, but something of their consciousness as well. Where had that consciousness gone now that the mannequins were destroyed? The thought troubled her as she prepared for bed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling her windows as it had on the night she'd first discovered the truth about the Majestic Theater. But this time it seemed to carry whispers, not of anger or vengeance, but of gratitude and release. Eleanor slept soundly that night, free from the nightmares that had plagued her since entering the theater. And if in her dreams she saw 17 figures walking away into a distant light, their forms no longer rigid and mannequin-like, but fully human once more, she considered it a gift, a final farewell from those who had waited 60 years for someone to tell their story. 1 year later, October 1983, the site where the Majestic Theater once stood was now occupied by a gleaming office tower, its glass facade reflecting the Chicago skyline. Nothing remained of the old building except a small bronze plaque in the lobby, acknowledging the 17 victims whose stories Eleanor had brought to light. Eleanor Mitchell was no longer writing for the lifestyle section. Her majestic series had earned her the position she'd always wanted in the Tribune's investigative reporting team, along with a Pulitzer nomination and offers from major newspapers across the country. She had chosen to stay in Chicago, drawn by both personal and professional connections to the city. On this particular morning, she sat in a coffee shop across from the new building, reviewing notes for her latest story and investigation into political corruption that had nothing to do with mannequins or long-buried murders. She was grateful for the normalcy. "Is this seat taken?" Eleanor looked up to find a woman in her early 30s standing beside her table, holding a copy of Echoes from the Walls, the book Eleanor had published earlier that year about the Majestic case. "Please." Eleanor gestured to the empty chair. The woman sat down, placing the book between them. "I'm sorry to interrupt your work, but I had to meet you. My name is Sarah Cooper. Lillian Cooper was my great-aunt." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "I tried to find Lillian's family for interviews when I was writing the book, but the trail went cold. We didn't know much about her ourselves," Sarah explained. "Just that she went to Chicago in the 1920s to be a dancer and never came home. My grandmother, her sister, spent years trying to find out what happened to her. I'm sorry she didn't live to learn the truth," Eleanor said softly. Sarah nodded. "She passed in 1979, but that's not why I wanted to meet you." She hesitated, then continued. "After I read your book, I went through my grandmother's things. I found letters from Lillian sent just before she disappeared. There was something in them that wasn't in your book or the newspaper articles." Eleanor leaned forward, her work forgotten. "What was it?" "Lillian wrote about modeling for a sculptor named Grimes. She said he had strange ideas about preservation, not just of the body, but of consciousness. He believed that with the right chemical process, he could create a kind of suspended animation that matches what I found in Grimes' journal," Eleanor confirmed. "Yes, but there's more." Sarah reached into her bag and removed a yellowed envelope. "This is the last letter my grandmother received from Lillian. It's dated October 17th, 1923, 3 days before she disappeared." She handed the envelope to Eleanor, who carefully extracted the fragile paper inside. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still legible. "Dearest Evelyn, something strange is happening at the theater. Mr. Grimes has been acting peculiarly, watching me during rehearsals with an intensity that frightens me. Yesterday he asked if I would model for a special project, something revolutionary, he called it. Mr. Blackwood is involved too. He offered me a substantial sum, more money than I could earn in a year of dancing. I should refuse, I know. There's something in their eyes I don't trust, but the money would mean I could finally come home, help Mother with her medical bills. It would change everything for us." Grimes mentioned something disturbing about his process. He said it creates a kind of sleep where the subject remains aware but cannot move or speak. He claims it's temporary, just for the creation of the model. But why would anyone want to be conscious during such a procedure? "If I do this and anything seems amiss, I've made arrangements with a stagehand named Thomas. He's agreed to check on me and intervene if necessary. I've also written a note to be found if the worst happens, though I pray it never needs to be read. I'll write again after it's done and let you know when to expect me home. Your loving sister, Lillian." Eleanor carefully refolded the letter, her mind racing. "This confirms so much of what I pieced together. Lillian knew something was wrong, but the money was too tempting to refuse. There's one other thing," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "After I found this letter, I started having dreams. Vivid dreams about Lillian, not as a mannequin, but as a young woman in 1920s clothing. In the dreams, she tells me she's free now, that all of them are free." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's air conditioning. "When did these dreams start?" "Right after the memorial service last year, the night they were finally properly buried." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I never included this in my reporting because I couldn't prove it, but I saw them move. The mannequins. They ... took care of Daniel Blackwood themselves." Instead of the skepticism Eleanor expected, Sarah simply nodded. "Lillian says thank you, in my dreams, for telling their story, for setting them free." "Do you think ... Ball quotes Eleanor hesitated, aware of how it would sound. "Do you think they're still out there somehow? Their consciousness or whatever Grimes preserved?" Sarah considered the question. "I think they were trapped for 60 years, aware but unable to act. When they were finally discovered, when their story was finally told, they were able to do what they needed to do, ensure justice was served. And then ... She smiled slightly. "Then they went home." After Sarah left, Eleanor remained at the table, watching people enter and exit the new building across the street, none of them aware they were walking on ground where 17 People had been imprisoned in a waking nightmare for over half a century. She thought about consciousness, about justice, about the thin membrane between memory and reality. Perhaps some mysteries weren't meant to be fully solved, only acknowledged and respected. That evening, as she walked home through the autumn twilight, Eleanor passed a department store with mannequins displayed in its windows. They were modern, featureless things with simplified faces and stylized poses, nothing like the eerily lifelike creations of Albert Grimes. Still, she couldn't help pausing, studying their blank expressions. For just a moment, in the reflection of the glass, she thought she saw one of them move, slight turn of the head following her movement. But when she looked directly at it, the mannequin was perfectly still. Eleanor smiled faintly and continued on her way. The majestic theater was gone, its secrets exposed, its victims laid to rest. If something of them lingered in the world, some echo of consciousness preserved through Grimes' terrible process, she hoped they had found peace. Behind her, as the store lights dimmed for closing time, the mannequin in the window slowly, deliberately, turned its head to watch her go. 5 years later, October 1988, the Chicago History Museum's new exhibition, Dark Reflections, the majestic theater and the mannequins of State Street, was drawing record crowds. Eleanor stood in the center of the main gallery, surrounded by photographs, newspaper clippings, and artifacts that documented both the original crimes and her investigation. Dr. Patricia Whelan, now the museum's director, approached with a glass of champagne. Quite a turnout for opening night. Your book is selling out at the gift shop. Eleanor accepted the glass with a smile. I'm still not entirely comfortable with all this attention. It feels strange to be celebrated for exposing such tragedy. You're not being celebrated for the tragedy, Patricia corrected her. You're being honored for bringing truth to light, for giving voices to people who were silenced. There's a difference. They walked through the exhibition together, past displays detailing Marcus Blackwood's rise to prominence in Chicago's theater world, Albert Grimes' early sculptural work, and the 17 victims whose lives had been cut short. A special section was dedicated to Eleanor's investigation, including copies of her Tribune articles and the Pulitzer Prize she'd eventually won for the series. What do you think of the centerpiece? Patricia asked as they approached the final room. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold. Inside, dramatically lit in the center of the space, stood a glass case containing fragments of the original mannequins. A hand here, part of a face there, pieces that had been recovered from the theater rubble and preserved for historical purposes. I'm not sure they would have wanted to be displayed again, she said quietly. Even in this form. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. They debated that extensively. But the advisory committee, including several victims' family members like Sarah Cooper, felt it was important to show the physical evidence of what happened to them. Not to sensationalize, but to ensure the truth can never be denied or forgotten. As they entered the room, Eleanor noticed a small group of visitors huddled around a display case containing Albert Grimes' journal, open to a page describing his preservation process. The chemical formulation itself had been redacted, a decision Eleanor had strongly advocated for during the planning of the exhibition. We've had several universities request access to the complete formula, Patricia mentioned, following her gaze. Chemical engineers, medical researchers, even military representatives. All denied, of course. Good, Eleanor said firmly. Some knowledge should remain buried. As closing time approached and the crowds thinned, Eleanor found herself alone in the final room, standing before the case of mannequin fragments. Despite the passage of 5 years, she still occasionally dreamed about that day in the theater, the impossible sight of the mannequins moving. Catherine Blackwood's painted eyes coming alive with 60 years of accumulated rage. Penny for your thoughts? The voice startled her. Eleanor turned to find an elderly security guard watching her with kind eyes. Just remembering, she replied. He nodded as if he understood perfectly. Must be strange, seeing all this laid out like this. History has a way of making even the most personal experiences seem distant, doesn't it? You seem to know a lot about it. The guard smiled. I've been following your story since '82. Worked security at the Tribune building back then. Used to see you coming and going at all hours while you were working on those articles, Eleanor. Studied him more closely. There was something vaguely familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. I'm sorry, I don't remember, Thomas, he supplied. Thomas Wilkes, Jr., my father was a stagehand at the Majestic, one of the 17. Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas Wilkes. He was mentioned in Lillian Cooper's letter. She said he had agreed to check on her to help if something went wrong. The guard's eyes grew sad. He tried. That's why he disappeared too. My mother always believed he'd run off, abandoned us. It wasn't until your articles that we learned the truth, that he died trying to help someone. I'm so sorry. Eleanor said softly. Don't be. Your work brought him justice, gave our family closure. He gestured toward the exhibition. All of this exists because you cared enough to dig deeper, to ask questions no one else would ask. As they talked, Eleanor noticed the guard occasionally glancing at the case of mannequin fragments, a strange expression crossing his face. Does it bother you, she asked, seeing pieces of them displayed like this? He considered the question carefully. Not really. Those aren't my father or any of the others, not anymore. They're just empty shells now. Whatever was trapped inside them is long gone. Gone where? The question had haunted Eleanor for years. Thomas Jr. smiled mysteriously. Where we all go eventually, I suppose. But free. Finally free. As the museum prepared to close, Eleanor made one final circuit of the exhibition. In the first room, a large photograph showed the majestic theater in its heyday, its marquee blazing with lights, well-dressed patrons filing through its ornate doors. She tried to imagine what it had been like, the glamour and excitement of Chicago's theater district in the roaring 20s, before the horror hidden within its walls. Near the exit, a small plaque listed the names of all 17 victims, with a simple inscription beneath, remembered, released, at rest. Eleanor touched the plaque gently, a ritual she had performed at the cemetery each year on the anniversary of their discovery. Rest well, she whispered. Outside, night had fallen over Chicago. As Eleanor walked toward her car, she noticed a group of modern mannequins in a store window across the street, arranged in casual poses advertising the latest fashions. For a brief moment, she could have sworn one of them raised its hand in a subtle gesture of farewell. Eleanor smiled and returned the gesture, no longer afraid of what it might mean. Then she continued on her way, leaving the past with all its darkness and its justice behind her. Present day. Chicago, the demolition of the Blackwood Tower was scheduled for early morning to minimize disruption to the busy downtown area. The building, which had replaced the Majestic Theater in 1983, was itself now outdated, making way for a new mixed-use development that promised to revitalize the historic State Street corridor. Mia Chun, a documentary filmmaker specializing in urban history, had secured exclusive access to film the demolition for her latest project. Layers, the palimpsest of Chicago architecture. With her small crew, she set up cameras at strategic points around the site, hoping to capture not just the physical destruction but something of the location's complex past. You know it stood here before this building, right? Her assistant Derek asked as they checked their equipment in the pre-dawn darkness. Of course, Mia replied. The Majestic Theater. That's partly why I wanted this footage so badly. This site has so many stories. Not just stories, Derek said, lowering his voice dramatically. Ghosts. Mia rolled her eyes. Please don't tell me you believe those urban legends. The stories had persisted for decades, strange sightings in and around the Blackwood Tower, particularly at night. Security guards reported display mannequins in nearby store windows changing positions between rounds. Cleaning crews claimed to hear whispers from inside walls. One popular tale involved an executive who worked late one night and encountered what he described as people made of wood in the elevator. My uncle was on the original demolition crew for the Majestic, Derek said defensively. He swears they found mannequins that moved on their own. Your uncle was probably reading Eleanor Mitchell's book, Mia countered, though a shiver ran down her spine despite her skepticism. She had read that book too, a journalistic account of murders from the 1920s. Mannequins found sealed in theater walls and a corrupt family's downfall, while Mitchell had never explicitly claimed supernatural occurrences. Her carefully worded descriptions had left room for readers' imaginations. As the sky lightened to a dull gray, the demolition team completed their final checks. Mia's main camera was positioned on a nearby rooftop, giving her a perfect vantage point of the controlled implosion. 2 secondary cameras were set at street level, protected behind safety barriers. 2 minutes to detonation, announced the demolition foreman over the radio. Mia checked her equipment one last time, ensuring everything was recording properly. As she adjusted her headphones, she thought she heard something strange, a faint sound like distant voices coming from the building itself. Did you hear that? She asked Derek. He shook his head, focused on his own equipment. The countdown began. Mia forced herself to concentrate on the task at hand, pushing aside the unsettling sensation that had come over her. 3.2.1. Double quotes, the explosions were precisely sequenced, designed to collapse the building inward upon itself. Mia watched through her viewfinder as the Blackwood Tower seemed to hesitate for a moment, then surrender to gravity. The structure folded in sections, a choreographed descent into rubble and dust. As the dust cloud billowed outward, temporarily obscuring the sight, Mia could have sworn she heard it again, voices, not of panic or pain, but of release, like a collective sigh echoing across decades. Later, reviewing the footage in her studio, Mia discovered something unexpected in the frame-by-frame breakdown of the collapse. During the split second when the building's foundation was exposed before being buried under debris, there appeared to be figures emerging from the ground, 17 distinct shapes rising like smoke from the earth before dispersing into the air. She played the sequence repeatedly, trying to convince herself it was a trick of light, a quirk of the dust patterns. But the more she watched, the clearer it became. Human silhouettes, briefly visible, then gone. Curious and slightly unsettled, Mia began researching the site more thoroughly. She already knew about Eleanor Mitchell's famous investigation and the 17 victims of the 1920s. But as she dug deeper into archived materials and interviewed people connected to the site's history, she uncovered a detail that hadn't been widely reported. During construction of the Blackwood Tower in 1983. Workers had discovered a hidden sub-basement beneath the Majestic's foundation, a space that didn't appear on any original blueprints. According to a single newspaper clipping, this underground room had contained an elaborate laboratory setup with antiquated chemical equipment preserved behind a sealed wall. The discovery had been quickly covered up, the room filled in with concrete before any detailed investigation could take place. Mia tracked down one of the construction workers who had been present that day. Now in his 70s, Harold Weber initially refused to discuss what he had seen. Only after Mia showed him the footage of the 17 figures rising from the foundation did he reluctantly share his story. There was something wrong with that room, he told her, his voice dropping to a whisper despite them being alone in his suburban living room. The equipment wasn't just old, it was wrong. Tanks connected to body-shaped molds, notebooks filled with chemical formulas and anatomical drawings, and the walls, he shuddered at the memory. The walls were covered with handprints like people had been pressing against them from the inside. Inside the walls? Mia asked, confused. Harold shook his head. Inside the molds. Like they were trying to get out while the process was happening to them. Mia felt a chill at his words. What happened to the notebooks? The equipment? The company said they turned everything over to the Historical Society, but I don't believe it. One of the supervisors, a man named Blackwood, took personal charge of clearing out that room. Most of it probably went into an incinerator. After the interview, Mia visited the Chicago History Museum, where parts of the original mannequins were still preserved. The exhibition had been updated over the years but remained popular, a dark chapter of local history that continued to fascinate visitors. As she studied the mannequin fragments behind their glass case, Mia noticed something the casual observer might miss: microscopic cracks in the material, as if the preserved substance had been trying to move, to break free of its rigid form. Interesting, aren't they? Mia turned to find an elderly woman watching her, elegantly dressed with keen eyes that suggested a sharp mind despite her advanced years. Very, Mia agreed. I'm researching a documentary about the site. The Blackwood Tower was just demolished. I know, the woman said. I watched it on the news this morning. She stepped closer to the display case. I've followed this story since the beginning. I knew Eleanor Mitchell. Mia's interest was immediately piqued. You knew Eleanor Mitchell? The journalist who broke the story? The woman nodded. My name is Sarah Cooper. Lillian Cooper was my great-aunt. She gestured toward one of the mannequin fragments, a delicate hand with perfectly formed fingers. That was hers. Mia struggled to contain her excitement. Miss Cooper, would you be willing to be interviewed for my documentary? Your perspective would be invaluable. Sarah studied her thoughtfully. Perhaps. But first, tell me why you're really interested in this story. There have been dozens of books, articles, even films about the majestic mannequins over the years. What makes your project different? Mia hesitated and decided on honesty. She took out her tablet and showed Sarah the slowed-down footage of the demolition, the 17 figures rising from the foundation. Sarah watched without surprise or shock, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. So they're finally gone, she murmured. Completely free at last. You believe they were still there somehow after all this time? But what Albert Grimes did was beyond conventional science, Sarah said quietly. He didn't just preserve bodies, he trapped souls. The mannequins themselves were destroyed in 1982, but something remained tethered to that place, to the ground where their prison had stood. That's why the stories never stopped, Mia realized. The sightings, the strange occurrences in the Blackwood Tower, double quotes, Sarah nodded. Echoes. Fragments of consciousness still seeking resolution. She touched the glass over Lillian's hand gently. But now the last physical connection has been broken. The building that replaced their prison is gone. They can finally move on completely. As they talked, Mia felt her documentary taking shape in her mind, not just a story about architecture or even historical crimes, but about how traumas can imprint themselves on physical spaces, how buildings can hold memories, how justice sometimes takes decades to fully manifest. "Will you help me tell their story?" Mia asked. "Not as a ghost story or urban legend, but as something real, a testament to the endurance of human consciousness and the long arc of justice." Sarah considered the request, her eyes still on the mannequin fragments. "Yes," she said finally, "on one condition. Your film must end with the demolition footage with their release. Let that be the final word on this story. Let them rest now." Over the next 6 months, Mia worked closely with Sarah Cooper and other relatives of the majestic victims. She interviewed historians, chemical preservation experts, and aging witnesses who had been present when the mannequins were discovered in 1982. She even managed to locate Thomas Wilkes Jr., now in his 90s but still sharp-minded, living in a retirement community outside the city. "I used to feel my father's presence sometimes," he told her during their interview. "Not as a ghost exactly, but as a kind of awareness, especially when I worked at the museum near those fragments. But after the Blackwood Tower came down, he smiled. Nothing, and that's a good thing. It means he's finally at peace." The documentary, titled The Echo, Chicago's Majestic Mystery, premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival to critical acclaim. Mia had been careful to present the more supernatural elements as personal testimonies rather than definitive claims, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions about what had really happened to the consciousness of the 17 victims. At the premiere after-party, held appropriately in the Chicago History Museum, Mia found herself standing once again before the display of mannequin fragments. "They look different somehow," she commented to Sarah, who had joined her. The older woman nodded. "I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen them like this before. Look closely." Mia peered at the fragments behind the glass. The material seemed less vibrant somehow, more like ordinary plaster or wax than the strange substance Grimes had created. The uncanny, lifelike quality that had disturbed so many visitors over the years had faded, leaving behind what appeared to be simple theatrical props. "It's as if whatever animated them is gone," Mia whispered. "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "Whatever connection remained between these fragments and their consciousness has finally been severed. These are just objects on museum pieces, nothing more." As the party continued around them, Sarah shared one final story she hadn't included in her interview. "The night after the demolition, I had a dream about Lillian. The last one after decades of dreams. She was young and beautiful, dressed as she would have been in 1923. She was standing in a bright doorway with 16 others behind her. She said, 'Thank you for remembering us. Now we can forget.' And then they walked through the door, and it closed behind them." The documentary became Mia's most successful work, eventually being acquired by a major streaming service and introducing the story of the majestic mannequins to a new generation. But true to her promise to Sarah, she ended the film with the demolition footage, the 17 figures rising from the foundation and dissipating into the morning air. The final text on screen read simply, "The Majestic Theater stood from 1921 to 1982, the Blackwood Tower from 1983 to 2023. The story of the 17 lives taken there spans over a century. May their memory endure, and their souls rest in peace." A year later, construction began on a new building at the site. During the groundbreaking ceremony, the developers unveiled plans for a small memorial garden to be included in the design, with 17 trees representing the victims of the Majestic Theater. Mia attended the ceremony, standing at the back of the crowd. As the first shovel broke the earth, she felt a sense of completion, a circle closing after more than a century. Whatever echoes had lingered here were finally silent. Whatever presence had remained was truly gone. That night, as she walked past a department store on State Street, Mia glanced automatically at the window display. The mannequins stood in their fashionable poses, completely still, utterly inanimate, just manufactured objects designed to sell clothing. She smiled to herself, relieved and a little wistful. The watchful eyes that had guarded Chicago's dark secrets for decades had finally closed. The mannequins in the walls had told their story and found their peace. As Mia turned to leave, she could have sworn she heard a whisper on the wind, not of anger or vengeance, but of gratitude. Then it was gone, leaving only the ordinary sounds of the city at night. The knowledge that some stories, no matter how long they take, eventually find their proper ending.